for the past few months, we've been running a reading group. I think some of the folks who follow us closely will already be aware of this. Um, and it's been a very interesting and exciting, even initiative for the folks who are regulars on the podcast, and also I hope for the folks who have been joining regularly into the reading group. And the group has focused on trying to gain an understanding of Nigerian political economy from a left perspective by reading some archival material and some um, academic accounts that have become available in the recent kind of archival revolution. I mean, that's maybe putting it too strongly, but the recent rediscovery of older left archival material that seems to be happening. So it's been really interesting, and I think it's allowed us access to new perspectives on key historical moments in Nigeria, and actually maybe even in the sort of West African region where Nigeria is situated. So that's by way of a brief kind of background as to the context for this recording. We thought that we would use this opportunity to talk about the reading group, how that's gone so far, and also to actually reflect on some of the big themes that have emerged in the first few sessions of the reading group. And to do that, we are joined by one of the participants. I guess I don't want to call him a scam artist yet, uh, unless he's willing to embrace that title in the way that someone like say Emeka has. But anyway, one of the participants in the reading group who's been highly highly engaged and has made some very interesting contributions, and who goes by Bobby. So Bobby, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, it's great to have you today, and look forward to picking your brain a bit about the reading group. Maybe we should start with a reflection on the reading group itself, like what we're aiming to get out of that, and how you found it so far, and then we can come back to talking about the session in particular. What do you think?
All right. Where to start? I mean, I'd say that the rationale, I mean, personally, my own opinion is that the rationale for the reading group is maybe two-pronged. So I think there's a community building aspect to it, which suggests that there's a sense in which, having put out or having done the podcast for a bit, we kind of thought that it was time to kind of reach out to those, have some kind of relationship with those who were constantly listening to, or those who are constantly listening to the podcast, and form some kind of community, beyond just, I mean, talking. I mean, these are guys who usually get feedback from naturally. So that's one reason why, I guess we decided to go down that route. But I think that, the more pertinent reason, the more important one, was that we had kind of noticed that, there was a cross-section of Nigeria, relatively small, on within the social media space who are already having conversations about left politics, but left politics from a more global perspective. So it was more the case that you heard people talk about left politics in America, left politics in Southern America, um, you know,
And
um,
the Russian Revolution,
left,
etc.
left politics everywhere else apart from Nigeria. So
Yeah.
we've kind of figured that people who discussed and this was being discussed in relation to Nigerian politics, local politics at the time, depending on whatever it was that was the prompting. And there was almost this dirt, of analysis that was informed by things, that the left, in Nigeria had done. Almost like people were talking as though the left never existed, and part of what we sought to do with the podcast initially was to fill that vacuum. And
Yeah.
so we kind of thought that setting up a reading group, making some of the texts that we had read, some of the ones we had read and some of the ones we hadn't read, I mean, that even from our own standpoint, that afforded us an opportunity to have much more broader conversations about the left, and then I think that so even though I said this was more two-pronged, I think it was more like multi-pronged. So one
Oh,
last
sure.
bit was that we decided that we had to go all the way back, because I mean, I'll speak for myself from my own reading of Nigerian history, and I'm speaking generally now on history, not left politics. I found that in reading back, you'd want to, or you'd be tempted to put a timeline to it and say, so you'd say you wanted to start reading Nigerian politics from independence. But no sooner had you covered independence, First Republic, Second Republic. At the time when I started, maybe even Third Republic, you then find out that, okay, you probably needed to go back all the way to 1914 to make sense of some of the things that happened in the 60s and, or even in the 50s in the lead up to independence. So recently, I've also found that perhaps 1914 doesn't even just cut it. So you might need to go back, to what some academics have called the informal empire, which even predates what you call it, the colonial era. So
boots on the ground colonial era.
Yeah, the man on the spot kind of time frame. Yeah. So I guess nice. I mean that in a nutshell was where we were coming from. I guess that and this is as people who run a podcast, or someone who is part of the podcast. So I guess that's my own take, but I figure that Bobby's take would probably be different. Or yours as well.
No, totally. I mean, I think that covers a lot of the discussion we had, and my own rationales also for getting involved with the reading group. I mean, maybe the only other thing I add is that sometimes in talking through current affairs and left politics and history in Nigeria, we use a lot of shorthands that draw on a kind of background knowledge of some historical events and some of the features of the Nigerian political economy. I mean, even the idea of the scam that we played with since the start presumes a certain shared understanding of the way that Nigeria operates and the way that Nigeria is integrated into the global economy. So we've been talking very often based on the assumption that, I mean, we have a shared starting point, and to some extent that the listeners have a shared starting point. Or at least we've just kind of gone forward hoping that people kind of catch up. So I think the reading group was partially conceived as an opportunity to reflect on some of those premises rather than just continue to take them for granted. And so I think we've tried to do some of that by sharing some readings that inform our perspectives on what the scam is, what it's about, and a lot of them really seem to come out of debates within radical political economy. So I think that kind of justified the political economy focus as well as the sort of historical approach. So, yeah, I mean, more talking from us, that wouldn't surprise anyone. I think it's time maybe to hear a bit from Bobby, who's a voice people are maybe less familiar with. And I guess the question for Bobby is, what made you want to join the reading group, be a part of it? And yeah, broadly speaking, I mean, has it met some of those expectations at least?
Yeah, so I've been listening to the podcast for a while. I think since at least the second episode. And even after that, I went back to the first. So, I mean, it
Mm,
was clear that the group of guys that were organizing, or at least the guys that spoke on the podcast, knew what they were talking about. And they had a wealth of material that they kept referencing to give us the quality of um, podcast that they were giving us. So when the bat signal came up that would you like a reading group, I mean it was a godsend because for a lot of us, right, we want to understand Nigeria on a deeper level than the a long list of personalities by the year they came. Because
mm,
basically that's how we know history. Bello, Yoronsi, Awo, you just know them going down, then we know
mm,
Obasanjo, and you know more about the person and the actual political economy.
mm,
For those of us that were lucky to live through it, they understand the intricacies more. But I mean,
yeah.
those of us born in 90s, 2000s, we have to go back to get material and we don't know where to start. So like Mege was saying, a lot of Nigerians that are interested in political economy are more likely to understand everyone else's political economy than Nigeria's.
Mm,
Before this reading group, I knew more about the Indian colonial period than Nigeria's. It's
mhm.
not for a lack of trying, but I mean, it's just knowing the right places to get materials, and that's the one gap that um, the scam group has helped to scammers, if it's okay to say that, have helped to close
Mm,
getting those materials readily available. And I mean, when you get materials like that, you read the references lead to more materials, and it just expands your horizon, and basically you're left better for it. So yeah, it's it's proven to be a really good experience so far.
brilliant. Well, yeah, I mean, I can hear Mega crying softly in the background. I think, yeah, that it's very nice to hear that, certainly. And it's been fun to be a part of. So, yeah, we'll definitely keep it up. And I think after this group is done, which will happen in the next couple of sessions, there will be opportunities to do future ones. So, for those who are, for various reasons, are not able to participate, don't despair too much. Yeah, further opportunities for that will arise, and hopefully, we'll take on more challenging themes and areas when that happens. So definitely stay tuned for more updates on that front. Right. So yeah, we've talked about the context a bit, and now maybe we should turn to the content. Mega has already gestured at the first theme, that we covered. And it was kind of, like I was saying earlier, centered on pre-colonial Nigerian history and political economy. And yeah, maybe what was slightly different about our approach is that we wanted to situate the pre-colonial period in a much longer history, going back to the Middle Ages, of what some folks have termed the birth of this sort of informal empire. And of course, people will be familiar broadly with some aspects of that history, including, of course, the transatlantic slave trade as a huge political and economic institution of, the period between the Middle Ages and um, the formal inauguration of colonization. One thing we were certainly very interested in was how capitalism emerged in what then became Nigeria, and what forms it took and didn't take. And yeah, one of the key um, dynamics that we were paying attention to in the pre-colonial period was labor and various forms of labor, and of course, slavery was a form of labor that presented various opportunities for the folks who ran that institution, but also um, presented various obstacles, challenges, limitations for the societies from which those people were extracted. So, but then we thought more widely, I think, about the question of labor. So Bobby, what do you think? I mean, are there aspects of the first session that sort of challenged or affirmed what you already had in mind about the kind of long history of pre-colonial Nigeria as it relates to questions of intergroup relations or the emergence of capitalism or other aspects of political economy?
More affirmation than anything else. Aside what I mentioned
Okay.
about the slow spread of pound sterling
Mm-hmm.
in the region. So what was affirmed for me was the effect of the slave trade
Yeah.
on any chance to industrialize, or let me not say industrial, for industrial capitalism to at least take roots. That's
Yeah.
having a whole demography um, removed from these societies. I mean, I feel the only way people can properly understand it is thinking about the past 2 years, not to
Mm.
going back to 2020, seeing the
Okay.
effects of COVID,
Okay.
what COVID did
Okay.
to
Okay.
supply chains, and I mean how
Mm.
everything nearly stopped for a moment. And
Yeah.
I mean, people were there, they just weren't at work. So
Mm.
nearly the same thing happened all across the coasts of the continent. People were literally carried away. And I mean, if you're transporting labor somewhere else, that means labor
Yeah.
is adding value somewhere else, and the
Yeah.
value, you guess the same amount of value is being lost where they were carried. So
Yeah.
I mean, it would. I'm very sure that's aside the incentives it would create for more intertribal wars to sell slaves to
Yeah.
accumulate more sterling and silver, what have you. So it's, for lack of a better word, is crazy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Definitely is. And yeah, I mean, I want to draw out an aspect of that too that struck me in a new way. I guess it probably affirmed as well intuitions I'd had before, but um, I definitely kind of saw it from a different perspective in the midst of our conversation, which is not as much the labor aspect, although I agree, but the trade aspect, that the export of all of these enslaved laborers um, cheapened the process or the kind of uh, commodity inputs that powered industrialization, right? Cheapened cotton, because all of a sudden you have all these people working for virtually free to produce cotton, which then allowed um, the purchase of that cotton grown in the Americas in Europe, particularly England, to be affordable in such a way that it could power the Industrial Revolution. So I was struck by the way in which access to that kind of artificially depressed economic resource, ended up being quite critical for Europe's development and Africa's underdevelopment, I guess. And then the second aspect of that also struck me is that in a lot of cases, by the peak of transatlantic slave trade, a lot of the commodities that were being formerly exported from the West African coast, including sugar from Sao Tome and gold from the sort of Ghana, Songhai axis, were then starting to be imported. Um, since a lot of the labor that was producing those commodities had been exported in the form of the slave trade. So, suddenly these former net exporters were transformed into net importers of the very same commodities, with gold now being produced more so in Brazil and trade, and exported into former import producers. So, yeah, it just struck me that kind of process of the transformation of a previously fairly productive segment of Africa, where Nigeria now falls, had occurred much earlier, than perhaps I had thought about for a while, because we tend to think about the transformation of populations that are now in Nigeria and a lot of West Africa into consumers in the global economy primarily as a fairly recent phenomenon or something very contemporary. So seeing that the roots of it were sown that early was striking.
Yeah. So to take a cue off, your own contribution, I think that what was a bit startling, about revelations around pre-colonial period was how much slavery, especially in West Africa, helped develop, Europe, England predominantly, and then the Americas. And by the Americas, I'm not talking about America, that's the United States of America. We're talking mostly about South America. So slaves from here, especially around the western coast, were shipped off to not just Europe but South America, which meant that there was much more manpower to till the soil or to mine for the purposes of mining, whether it was gold, whether it was ore, whatever it was. And that kind of distended what would come during the colonial period. This is not something that I was totally oblivious of, but I think the force of it just became a little bit more evident over the course of our reading sessions. By distant, what I mean to say is that by the time that we got round to the Berlin Conference, the Scrabble for Africa, the conscious decision to colonize, Africa by the metropoles or the colonies by the metropoles, we were not on the same footing with the rest of the world, as it. So that even the incorporation of Africa, or more specifically here Nigeria, into the peripheral global capitalist system was obviously going to be really slow, because the manpower had been depleted. And then there's this popular saying about how slave trade happened in Africa, and how we lost our best minds, or our strongest. Those were usually, I don't know if that's how it went. Usually the strongest that were sold, or was it the weaker ones? I'm not sure. But by the time we come around, this depletion of human resource would come to haunt us by the time it became a conscious effort to incorporate Nigeria into the global capitalist system.
Yeah.
It's I guess you already mentioned it when you say that what that did was that in terms of commodity trades, you got more from in terms of output. These things were measured in tons and are still measured in tons till tomorrow. You got more output from Southern America, to fund to power the industries in England first, and then in the US in the later part of the um, um, the later part of the 19th century. I think what's also important to mention is that this didn't happen over a period of 1 decade or 2 decades or 3 decades. This happened for centuries. And then we're putting a timestamp to it. We're talking about from between 1450 to 1900 to the turn of the 20th century. I mean, just right about when colonialism then became a thing.
No, I mean, I guess maybe we should affirm some of those points before we delve further into the period of formal colonization. But one other thing I think we maybe haven't emphasized enough in our conversation about pre-colonial period is the question of how the groups in what became Nigeria and the broader West African region were relating to each other amidst this process of unequal integration into the global economy. And for me, one aspect of that relationship that seemed to be a bit of a myth buster, and I think this was most emphasized in the use of Bala Usman readings that we did, was the fact that these groups were quite deeply intertwined. So by the point in time where the colonial state is formally inaugurated, colonial science, which kind of was undergirded by kind of racialist ideologies and typologies, sort of emphasized the differences amongst the people groups, trying to draw quite neat distinctions between linguistic groups and cultural groups and this sort of thing. And of course, this carries on into the nationalist period, where these differences were re-emphasized and deepened in some ways. But from the Bala Usman reading and some of the other debates, it seemed like these differences in the period prior to colonization were a little more ephemeral, given the extent to which there was extensive trade across the geographies of what is now southeastern Nigeria, northern Nigeria, and southwestern Nigeria. And I think, one thing Bala Usman emphasized that, might not have been totally novel to us as kind of a more left-oriented crowd, but I think it certainly flies in the face of contemporary discourse in Nigeria, is the fact that the pre-colonial sovereign states, or the pre-colonial centralized states in what became Nigeria, were often multilinguistic. So the latter day ethnic irredentists will tend to frame ethno-nationalism as the pursuit or the return to a glorious past of ethnic homogeneity. But it was intriguing to encounter in our readings the contention that the glorious past was not ethnically homogeneous or linguistically homogeneous. Like, these city-states were melting pots and it's actually the process of colonization and the nationalist movement that transformed, these quite plural entities, at least politically, if not practically, into, or kind of set this aspiration for homogeneity. What do you guys think? I mean, what was that striking to you at all, or and is it fair to say that that does question a lot of some of the premises that undergird contemporary political discourse in Nigeria, or am I overstating that?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's not much to say to chip into what your assertion just now, um, except just to home in on it. That
Mm,
part of what you come to learn, with um, if you're armed solidly with a knowledge of pre-colonial Nigeria, is that um, essentially, especially through Yusuf Bala's Usman,
mm,
that that Nigeria is bogged down by this, what he calls the three myths,
mhm,
of about the formation of Nigeria, um, which you can break down to the myth of 1914. Uh, that the myth that Nigeria is an arbitrary creation,
mhm,
and the myth that Nigeria has no clear-cut international boundaries.
mhm.
Um, I think reading him, you would find plausible grounds why how as to why these myths need to be dispelled, or how essentially they are actually myths and really founded in any reality. Um, and that these myths probably didn't even um, take on a life of its own until sometime around the 1940s.
Mhm, mhm,
Again, like you said, um, where in the heady days of nationalism,
yeah,
of the struggle for self determination,
mm,
um, and that these things weren't also helped by the fact that the constitutions, um, I think I'm speaking mainly or largely about the Macpherson Constitution, where um, the sort of things that breathed life into what um,
yeah,
ordinarily should have been left to the imagination of those who pushed for it. But yeah, so I think that's one take out. You,
yeah,
you know, um, there's nobody knew themselves as Yorubas or as Igbos or as
right.
Hausas, or Fulanese in those days.
Mhm,
Um, not especially in the big city states, and
right.
how maybe even anthropologists, Western anthropologists, were the ones who wrote this into our own history. We
Mm,
just soaked it all up like sponges. So
right.
it's nice to interrogate that the beginnings of this myth, and with a view to at least dispelling those that we can't factually.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. Um, to keep things interesting, let's jump forward in future again, um, and go back to Bobby, who had been talking about marketing boards, as maybe an unsurprising example of the way in which the colonial enterprise was fundamentally an extractive one. So, Bobby, do you want to say a little bit more about marketing boards for those who might not have heard of them before, or maybe have heard of them in passing but don't really understand what they were about? I mean, what were the marketing boards, and why do you feel that they were central to the colonial enterprise from
Okay.
your perspective? Sure.
Um, I think it's best to explain the way the colonial enterprise worked in the first place
Mm-hmm.
before situating the marketing board's role within that process. So the way the enterprise works in the first place is basically to see it as getting the easiest way to see it is as trying your best to get free goods or free capital. So the um the colonies provided using Britain as an example, right? The colonies provided Britain with the necessary two things, aside the necessary raw materials at dead cheap prices to industrialize. And the surplus that came from trading these materials or from the process of industrialization itself served as capital that was then exported to the rest of Europe. How do you get these things at? I mean, if you're paying, if you pay, if you have to pay laborers properly, it's no longer the colonial enterprise, right? So you're paying below the rates,
It's
and
it's entrepreneurship if you're paying them according to the law.
get
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Sorry, yeah.
So you're extracting that below the rates and getting both the raw materials and capital of these people. So how the marketing boards help to do this? You had the rural farmers or the peasants, right, who were engaged in agricultural enterprise. They brought their goods to the marketing boards, and the peasants were paid money for those goods. So how the extraction process basically happened here. This is where the surplus was made because they were paid far below the rates of what these goods were then sold on the international markets.
Yeah.
So that was where the gap was made. That was where the profits that was now used that where Britain got its gain from. The marketing board was the main mechanism for doing this. So you now had farmers who had to go back and not just subsist on those, if you will call them wages, but they equally had to pay taxes on it. So basically, the colonies are not running on some form of investment. They only began to get proper investment towards the end in universities and all of that. They were running on the taxation of these farmers, right?
Yeah, a double taxation of, you could say.
Exactly. Yeah. So they were underpaid for the goods and they were now taxed on top. So it was a case, it was basically naked extraction. And the marketing board was the oil rig. That was where everything was taken from them.
Yeah. I think that does a good job of it. I mean, but I want to give Emeka a chance to reflect on this. Emeka really gets worked up when you start talking about marketing boards, particularly with the role they played in the sort of developmental phase of colonization, quote unquote, after World War II, right? When the colonial state has to kind of figure out how to justify itself since Hitler has made racism a little less cool, a little less cooler than it used to be. Emeka, do you want to say something about the kind of the high point of the kind of transition from civilizing mission to the colonial state as a developmental agent and the role the marketing boards played in that? Or just, I guess, your wider reflections on marketing boards more generally. Do you buy much of how Bobby read their role in the colonial project?
That's a loaded one. I think Bobby does a good job of it. If we begin to talk about marketing boards, we should day break.
Yeah. No, I mean, and of course, I think there's a plan to delve more deeply into the marketing boards as one of the foundational scams, right? So, don't let's not be here till daybreak. I guess I'm just curious as to how you would quickly summarize your perspective on marketing boards. And I know that you often situate them within the transition from civilizing mission to development and the post-war colonial state and all of that. So, yeah, just wondering how you would reflect on that now, in summary.
Uh, let's just say that the marketing boards in themselves, if run properly, aren't entirely bad. Isn't an
Okay.
entirely bad idea.
Mm,
Depends on how these things are executed. And that's why um, the debates are always heated for against marketing boards.
mm,
What
mm-hmm.
what we can be clear about was the sort of marketing boards that the Brits gave us,
Mm,
and a good way to think about it. I don't know if you know. Just thinking about it in terms of transitions from a civilizing nation to outright colonialism,
yeah.
does justice to it. But let's just say that marketing boards, um, surfaced in Nigeria around 1940, 1940s. I think that would be 1947. I'm not sure.
Mm,
And this was just after the Second World War, at a
yeah.
time when I think in the UK it's called the Blitz, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not sure. But anyways, after the Second World War, the
Yeah.
British had to rebuild. Um, and they had to depend on their colonies to
Mm-hmm.
do this. Um, they also had to, and this wasn't the first time they were doing it, but increasingly bring make sure that deploy the use of tariffs. Taxation itself became um, a big deal,
Mm-hmm.
and the political economy in Nigeria at the time was such that, as we mentioned earlier, it was really a slow haul, long drawn out process to incorporate um, people who were former slaves, in the Nigeria that was, before the colonialization really set in, in
Yeah.
its formal sense, into the wage labor. What you found was that at once slavery became a thing of the past in interiors in Nigeria. Um, the British had thought that that would in turn mean an automatic shift from slave labor into um, wage work. But what you then found was that increasingly people went into um, farming, and not farming for in commercial sense, but
Mm-hmm.
smallholder farmings as
Yeah.
but I mean essentially these people were dealing in cash crops.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then it became a challenge for the British to even tax these people. So they came up with this idea of marketing boards where, because the vast majority of Nigerians had taken to farming cash crops for exports, you will then tax their products or their produce at the farm gates. Not only were they taxing them, they had already set the price for these things. And the reason why this price was set was so that they could compete favorably with their competitors, within the global capitalist system. So what you found that they were doing was that they set the price way below what was obtainable in the international market.
Yeah.
Um, that in turn meant that you had people working hard to churn out um, two times what they had churned out, say maybe 20 years prior, um, for just to get a little above what they used to get,
Mm-hmm.
20 years, before that. So while
Yeah.
global produce price all over the world, especially in South Asia, yeah. Let's not demarcate. In Asia and the Americas were soaring. Um, the price increase in Western Africa or in Africa was was an increase of maybe 10-15%, at the most 20-30%, whereas in the rest of the world you were having price increases for close over 100% increase for things like palm oil, kernels, and all that stuff.
Yeah,
so
and I guess we should just, for the interest of people who might be more visual, we should also add the image of the groundnut pyramids in northern Nigeria and cocoa in southwest Nigeria. Like, this is the moment when these commodities become critical to the Nigerian economy.
Yep. So I think the larger point that needs to be made here is that this was the way that the colonial government was in this way that the colonial government was extracting surplus. Pricing these things way below, adopting middlemen who were also making a killing from these kinds of trades, because she then had middlemen who went and got these things from the farmers at the farm gates and then gave it and then passed it on to the marketing boards. And it's interesting the way Nigeria developed in that sense. So if you listen to people who talk about history and the bit that they know about history, you'll find that a lot of people sing praises of this middleman. One of which is Emeka Ojukwu's father, but these are the ways in which these people came into money about that time, either as transporters or core middlemen. So basically, they were ripping off the farmers to enrich the importers or the both the marketers and the importers. So the question you ask is, what were they marketing? They were marketing our produce. So it's almost as though, okay, you guys have produce, but you can't sell it. We would need to market it for you. And because we're marketing it, we're taking this bit off you for 10 naira, whereas these guys were going to be selling it for maybe 100 naira, and then the middleman will be selling it to them maybe at about 30 naira or thereabout. But not just that, they were also taking much more volume than was needed, because some of these things were sent to industries in England, yes, but also to the British government, which I'd like to differentiate, from the colonial government. The British government to subsidize food, in their own place. So it was kind of in the ways, the problem with the marketing boards was in the way that, it was thought out and how policy, the execution of it, as a policy framework. It's also important to also note that if you sequence these things and go back, from the 40s, which was about the time when these guys were rounding up to leave, and go all the way back, you'd notice a pattern that these policies, colonial policies, always changed, always they were always suited, for the metropoles as against, the colonies, and some of them were made deliberately to stunt the growth in Africa. So even if we say that the initial period of pre-colonial period set Africa back in terms of, so I think that's what we mean when we say, so even when there was a conscious decision to integrate Africa into, the colonial, into the global capitalist system, there were still policies that were geared to kind of halt its own progress, because, you needed to sort out empire first. So Britain had to be able to compete with Germany, it had to be able to compete with France, and then much later, about 1940s, also compete with America, which had just become, an empire as a result of the Second World War. because Britain had to have a strong footing, within the global, economic circuit. The colonies had to suffer for it. So I guess that's the sense in which one can think about marketing boards in the early 40s, which might then change when you think about it from the 50s, when the nationalists had then won their right to self-determination and were gradually going to govern themselves. And what then they then did with marketing boards within regional party structures. So you think about what the AG did with it, with the cocoa board, and what's that party called, the MPP in the north, with the groundnut pyramids.
MPC.
Yeah.
And NCNC with palm oil.
With palm
so
oil.
And I want to come to that next. I mean, for sure, because the marketing boards definitely are a very interesting segue into the First Republic. I mean, you could almost say that the fight for self-determination or the fight for independence was a fight over who was going to manage the marketing boards. But before we come to that, I want to throw a provocation at you guys because, again, one of the concerns at the heart of this conversation has been the question of the development of capitalism. What were the political obstacles or, facilitators or factors that facilitated the development of capitalism in the region? By and large, we've talked about obstacles. But could one say that there were some ways in which the colonial period, more so than the pre-colonial period, actually contributed to some aspects of capitalist production developing in what became Nigeria? And I'm thinking in particular of two ways. One is the process of the indigenous formation of capital. So Emeka has now talked about the merchants, the traders who served as middlemen between the colonial government and the farmers. Of course, there were middlemen in the slave trade as well, right? Because the slave traders, the kind of trading companies that managed the ships, generally weren't going into the hinterland, and the Europeans that were going into the hinterland for most of the slave trade were the minority. So there was some measure of indigenous capital formation even in that period, and of course there were also the what are now called the traditional rulers, but back then were the state. You're thinking in the cases where states were centralized, of examples like the Sokoto Caliphate or Old Oyo Empire, Nupe, Kanem Bornu, and to some extent Arachuku and Boni and Brass, those kinds of more centralized kingdoms. And of course, the folks who sat atop those thrones were able to accumulate, even in pound sterling, as Bobby has spoken about. But you could say that the colonial period, in a way, deepened that process for a select group of people. Now that's a provocation I'm throwing at you because that's a contentious debate. Some people say actually the colonial state blocked the process of capital formation because it prevented indigenous capitalists from competing on equal footing with the mercantilist firms. So I'd be interested in hearing your take on that question. Like, is indigenous capital formation being stimulated by the colonial state through the creation of all these new ways of accumulating, including through the administrative institution, people actually working in colonial administration, or is it primarily blocking indigenous capital formation? And then the second aspect of how colonial state shapes the development of capitalism is wage labor. And we've been alluding to this already, how one of the formal rationales for boots on the ground colonization was Britain's discovery that the slave trade was immoral, at least how they frame it, right? But the abolition of the slave trade and the transition to wage labor was actually one of the on paper rationales for setting up the colonial state. And yeah, wage labor is one of the fundamental attributes of capitalist as opposed to a pre-capitalist mode of production. So could you say that the colonial state, in a sense, did achieve that aim to some extent, at least, or maybe to frame it less provocatively, to what extent would you say that the colonial state did achieve that aim of, to some extent, putting in place wage labor and kind of inaugurating a wage laboring class, certainly in the cities, and if not in the countryside. So I wonder how you guys would reflect on those questions of, capital formation and the extent to which this colonial state made it possible or inhibited it in certain ways, and also wage labor. Bobby, you wanna take a shot first?
Yeah, but okay. So, at the risk of digressing, I think the first way I'll look at it before um giving my understanding of the question is
Mm,
the the whole essence of colonialism, at least on the um, global scale, right, was
yeah.
acting, at least for capitalism, was acting as a valve for the inflationary pressures in the metropoles. I
Mm,
mean, like, as the cheaper goods, right, got to the metropoles and they could buy, the proletariat there could buy at cheaper prices. This was only
yeah.
possible because there was another proletariat, or there were peasants on this side of the earth that accepted the um, the low wages,
The
and
cost,
should
yeah.
I say exactly, and who now had unemployment exported to them. All right.
Mm,
So knowing this, knowing this formation, knowing this system, I don't
yeah.
think the British government, by intention, had any plans, right, of
Mm-hmm.
giving local capital formation any leeway.
Mm,
What I would say happened was, by intention at least, was the formation of a proletariat here by virtue of the um, people needed to run, aside the menial jobs needed to run the colony, because for the most part, at the beginning and towards the end of um, boots on the ground colonialism, it was the agricultural sector that carried um, agricultural produce, that produced the most value for that produced the value for Britain. So it was, by nature, it was peasantry, right, that
mm,
produced this value. So the proletariat class that eventually formed was the only thing I say by intention um, began, because at the end of it all, it was that same proletariat class that um, got the, what's the word? The nationalist movement pulled a
mm,
lot from that same class at the
right.
end of the day, and it was members of that class like Bello, who was a clerk, and um, some others. I think Funlai was a teacher, and so it
Mm-hmm.
was members of that class that would eventually go on to enter the political sphere and negotiate the independence process. As for
Well, although some
cap-
people might say those people were kind of petty bourgeoisie, right? Because they were not necessarily involved in direct production as much as they were kind of clerical, um, like a clerical laboring class. I don't,
yeah,
those
I
distinctions
mean,
might not
yeah,
be
technically
so
working class
enlightening, but
still
yeah.
proletariat,
Okay,
but
okay,
I get you. But the thing is, they were involved in wage labor, so that's what I mean.
right.
Obviously,
Okay,
not
okay, okay.
industrial proletariat, but
Sure.
proletariat regardless. So
Hmm.
yeah, that was the group that eventually negotiated the independence process, and part of it via unions were more
Hmm.
militant. As for capitalist formation within the region, I'd say it was more a byproduct, right?
Hmm.
Um, like Megan mentioned, some of the middlemen that made up a small merchant class
Yeah.
eventually. built up capital for themselves. And I mean, if you're going to block them, then there really isn't any way to make the whole process move smoothly. So it's one of those things
Right.
where it has to happen to for the process to move forward.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of reluctant byproduct rather than,
It's a reluctant
yeah.
byproduct, yes.
Okay. Yeah. How about wage labor more broadly? Like, in America, I'm thinking here of, for instance, the mines, in the colonial state, or even to some extent, like, some measure of small scale industry that shifted from more artisanal production to, you know, slightly more mechanized production in the course of colonial rule. Like, to what extent would you attribute or give some credit, quote unquote, to the colonial state for stimulating some measure of um, a wage laboring class in addition to the clerical folks that, yeah, that Bobby has alluded to?
Saeed, you won't keep person. So, where does one start? Okay, so we're talking colonial Nigeria, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
At least for the next 3 minutes.
all right, I'll try. That'll be hard, but I'll try. So we're talking about 60 years at the very least, starting from 1900, of formal colonialism in Nigeria, right? They were not. It's not. It's a very layered conversation, so it's not very straightforward. So that parts of Bobby's submission that I don't entirely agree with. Yeah, because at the risk of giving praise or heaping the British, with praise, because I mean, deep in my heart, I think that a lot of the colonial administrators were stupid. I mean, not very bright people. And I mean, if you read the literature, you'll find out. What had happened was that this was a reactionary government, and there was often a breakdown between the colonial office in the UK, in Britain, and the colonial government in Nigeria. All right, there were wires always going back and forth. So a lot of what we read about in the literature today is as a result of those wires, which are now declassified, and then we can now see some of the communications that went by. So I think that's the point that I was alluding to earlier on. There were ways in which the Great Depression affected colonial policy, also affected a lot of Africans in the colonies. All right. So there were times when you also had boom periods, and then there were times when you had the lean years. Okay. So I think that the larger point that I'm trying to make is to say that the British people, they picked their winners amongst us. All right. The idea of middlemen was not it was intentional. There was nothing. It wasn't. It was not as a result of anything. No, it was intentional. Ojuku's father, Akari Louis Odumegwu Ojuku, was already at the Lagos Chamber of Commerce from maybe the 1920s. All right, so you need to think about that. All right, he was picked. Now here's the thing. Okay, part of what colonialism involved, especially when you read, our literary guys, if you read the Achebes of this world, if you read maybe the Shoinkas, the guys who dissect these issues, was the fact that there were people who didn't welcome even the missionaries. Okay, so let's even think about the two sets of nationalists that we had. Those from the traditional ruling families, and
let's call them the rural nationalists.
Yeah, and then the more modern nationalists. All right.
The urban ones.
Yeah, the urban ones. So the colonialists were torn between, which of these people to incorporate, and then they went with the traditional ones initially, but they started to get, backlash from the urban ones, all right, who were Sarus essentially, or slaves who had just returned from slavery. Um, we're talking about the Ajayi crowders. And then there was a lot of, and that's why Lagos was a hotbed of colonial politics, because you also had the Lagos Press, so that what you call the Lagos Press today has a long history that dates back up till, maybe the 1910s. All right, so these guys had been piling pressure on the colonial. So it wasn't. So these things are not straight. There was a bit. That's why it's called a struggle. There was a bit of struggle. There was a bit of horse trading going in there somewhere. So it's not the case that you. So I'll give you an example. Right after right after in the interwar years, and between the interwar years, and I hope I'm getting this right, and the period of the Great Depression, things were bad for people in Nigeria, right? Up until the 30s, up until the 30s, right? It probably shock you to know that the price of and this is where colonial policy then comes in. Britain did everything to stifle the price of produce coming out of the West Coast, right? Simply because in prosecuting, especially the Second World War, it had drawn on its dollar reserves. All right. So by the time the war ended, especially during the course of the war, they depended, and then that's when you have. So what the French people called a single currency union, or what they call that, what they call that thing now, where their currencies are tied to. We also had that kind of
zone.
So we had the Sterling Union,
Sterling Group.
where the Sterling Group, where so it's not it's a system that became perfected years after the war, but there had been some trial and errors before that. So not to take too much time, the point I'm trying to make is that I hope I'll make it clearly, is that yes, there were boom and bust periods in the 60 years between 1900 and 1960 when we got our independence, and that the struggles, between groups, also meant that, okay, so before I continue, in those lean years, right, when a farmer had to put in twice the work, to get volumes of because the prices of produce were coming down. So to get what you used to get maybe a decade before then, you would need to put in twice the work because the value of the produce had come down. So you need to turn out more produce to be able to maintain a certain standard of living. Okay. So what you then found was that farming, which was initially a viable enterprise in the late 19th century, which was, at the heart of the 1897 strike, where the Governor General in Lagos had gambled, thinking that, because they had waded into the interiors with a bid to stop slavery in the Yoruba environs. I'm talking about Oyo now. The big city states in the West, anyway, in the Southwest, they had taken it for granted that once they had been able to achieve that you then have an influx of wage laborers who want to work in the ports because they were building the ports at the time, who want to work in the railways, on road and spark. But that was not happening because it was more fruitful to work as a farmer then, and then these guys were bringing, so at the heart of it was a wage reduction kind of thing. So this guy came and wanted to bring down the wages, and then they were like, no, he also wanted to increase the hours. So there was a conflict there. But by the 30s and 40s, and early 40s, late 20s, early 30s, up to the late 30s. The truth of the matter was that wage labor had become an alternative to farming because of the prices, right? And don't also forget that that's when these guys increasingly started to tax, produce too. So there had been a shift,
giving us things like the About Women's War, right?
Riots, and also remember that the eastern heartland was the one that they found the most difficult to conquer, and at the heart of all of this, like you said, was the About Women's Riot of 1929. But there were other, skirmishes with the Ekumeku, the people, the Aro. In fact, at the heart of the Aro, earlier. So there was the Aro expedition in 1901. They didn't quite conquer the Eastern Heartland until maybe the late 1910s, 1919 perhaps, early 20s. So these things, they were still expanding. They needed more produce and all of that. And that in doing all of these things, they were bringing more people into wage labor, but they were also establishing what they call the indirect rule. So it was as a result of that indirect rule that they began to choose their own winners. And part of how they were able to do it, even though they were not in cahoots, so to speak, with the missionaries, but there were cases where interests overlapped, in that sense. So the tastes of what will later become the Nigerian elite were shaped by the missionaries, and the colonialists, themselves, to the extent that, don't forget that this incorporation that we say that, that we talk about of the peripheries, of which Nigeria and African countries were part of, or are one leg of, to the global capitalist system, by which we mean the metropoles, either as a collective or as individual metropoles that colonized this country, was not a one-way traffic. So it wasn't just a question of moving. It wasn't just a question of moving produce, cheap produce, to the industries in Birmingham or Liverpool or Manchester. It was also a question of moving cheap goods, down to. So they had to create a market. Ways,
so they were selling shit to our guys again, be it whiskey or mirrors, or more interesting things like guns and such as well. But so I guess what I'm taking out of what you're saying is that it's not just colonial policy was having paradoxical effects, right? Like, again, similar to what Bobby is saying, sometimes inadvertently producing things that look like wage labor or look like an indigenous elite.
Comprador class.
Right, a comprador class. But these processes were also reinforced by structural forces that were not under the control of the colonial state strictly, such as economic boom and busts, and this sort of thing. I guess, we're almost out of time, but I want us to briefly reflect on the First Republic. And not, hopefully, we'll have a chance to return to this when we talk a bit about marketing boards. But if just briefly, I think it would be good to also draw out some of the ways in which the First Republic either deviated from these trajectories or reinforced them. In reflecting on what was striking or peculiar in the readings and discussions about this period to you guys. So, how would you sum up maybe the key insights that you gleaned about the First Republic? Or maybe another way to put it is like, through the reading group, but also beyond. What are some of the key things that you think, in a couple minutes, someone listening to this show, or someone going to buy a cigarette or whatever, but thinking about the First Republic, should take away? So Bobby, do you want to take a stab? I mean, what are your highlight points about the First Republic that maybe draw on the readings
let me set
discussion so far? Or Emeka, since you've been warm,
I want to trigger Bobby.
But
Bobby.
I'm going to cut you off if you try to filibuster. Like before. So
no. All I'm going to say is that the nationalist movement in what became known as Nigeria started essentially in the 1940s from a political party perspective, right? So I'm speaking of the NCNC. All right. And then much later, the AG. I think that was about 1950. Okay. Right. We didn't get the correct me if I'm wrong, is it NPP until MPC? Yeah, until the eve of the elections or so.
The 50s.
Yeah, in the late, by the mid 50s or late 50s. Anyways, my own take, and I might be wrong, is that between when the advocacy for self-determination started first with Herbert Macaulay and Nnamdi Azikiwe, and then got heightened by the introduction of AG, and the formation of the colonial board was maybe 2-3 years. Okay, so we're talking about 1944, 45, maybe 46, and 1947, 48. So within the NCNC, they had this radical formation called the Zikist movement, who started to grow, started to gain consciousness, and then even though started as fanboys of Nnamdi Azikiwe, found by 1948-49, especially after the colliery incidents in Enugu, the shootings, the massacre.
Yes, the Eva Valley massacre is what nationalists called it. Colliery incident is what the British the colonial state called it. But anyway,
all right. Yeah, so I think especially after that, the ideological consciousness began to bloom, and then they realized that, oh, hold on, I don't think Nnamdi is on the same page with us. Azikiwe is not on the same page with us. And then what they sought to do was to trigger a revolution, But it would strike people to find out that part of the people who helped quell, that movement was Nnamdi Azikiwe himself. All right. So my working theory, I mean, let me provoke here, is that by the 1950s, when the colonial government then banned the Zikist movement outrightly, not without reason, to be honest, because I mean there was an attempt made on the life of one of the colonial officials, or it was alleged that there was an attempt on his life. And then these guys wanted to stir up all sorts of trouble. But what I think my working theory is that by the 1950s, the British had already cut deals with people like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo and the guys from the MPC to say that if you can tarry a few minutes, for a while rather than hand over governance or power to the guys who have been using by way of the native authorities, which is the side that you call them the rural nationalists, right? Or the traditional nationalists.
Yeah.
We can see that your agitation is beginning to pay off. But here, this is the deal, right? We'll hand over power to you, and at the heart of the power that we hand to you is this marketing board. This is how it works. This is what you need to do. Any party that comes, and that's how we even came about regionalism. I haven't quite fleshed it out, but based off the readings that we've been doing for the last month or so, and the direction in which this conversation has started to go, in terms of us trying to discuss and find common grounds or places where we disagree, I am beginning to feel that that there's a little bit of inquiry that can be made in that direction. It's always been at the back of my head, but that there was a compromise somewhere, and that at the heart of that compromise was control of the marketing boards within regions.
Yeah. Most certainly, Bobby. As I told you, whenever you mention the marketing boards, Emeka really starts chomping on the bit. So let's, yeah. So let's give him a moment to catch his breath, and give you an opportunity to reflect. I mean, actually, it's fair that he raises those issues because, of course, the transition from colonial period to the First Republic was really facilitated by this nationalist agitation. So, it would have been unfair to jump from our conversation about the colonial political economy into the First Republic without talking briefly about nationalism. So, thankfully, Emeka's done a bit of that work for us. But I mean, I want to, kind of draw the conversation to a close with some brief reflections on the First Republic. So, Bobby, how would you frame that question, or tackle it really? If you were asked, like, what was the First Republic really about from a political economy perspective?
Well, for the First Republic, there are two things that I noticed were prominent there that I would say carried over onwards to what Nigeria is today. The first of them would be ethno-nationalism as the politics of the day. I mean, even though the three major parties that ruled the country, right, were basically carved along ethnic lines. Even though the NTNC, many would say the NTNC had a broader reach, but as much as it did, it was still perceived very differently, especially going into the 50s. That's when before the handover of the marketing boards.
Yeah.
So the NPC, I mean, the AG, a lot of, at the beginning of the formation, a lot of it was pretty explicit when they were recruiting. Let me not call it recruiting, but at least getting some sort of assistance from the trying to get a measure with the traditional ruling is to give it some sort of prestige. So the NPC was basically just what the feudal structure entering the political arena using the modern political party system. So I mean, knowing this going forward, it becomes much clearer how ethnic politics played a role then and continues to play a role today, because the same way that when conflict hits during that period, ethnic mobilization was the go-to in both garnering support and in trying to show up their respective territories, if you can call it that. So those same, knowing, like what you said before, that those areas were what later became three regions, were melting pot of ethnicities, systems, right? And it was the colonial period that basically carved up these special ethnic identities, what you know today as Yoruba and Igbo, before now transitioning into the party system and into the very sad situation we have today with the way ethnic politics mobilized. The second thing again is the for lack of a better word, I would call it corruption, right? The kind of corruption that developed in that era, when the marketing boards were handed over. So seeing at that point in time, right, the relationship the Nigerian states, you couldn't even call it, let's call it the British colony. The relationship the British colony had with um, with the Nigerian people at the time was one of master and slave, and that relationship basically translated into what will later become Nigeria when they handed over. Meaning the British administrative class were a clear upper class even before our local merchant class, the peasantry, and wage laborers. Before you could even consider the local class formation, there was always a British administrative class at the top of it, who were higher wage earners and had political control. By virtue of they were high wage earners by virtue of that political control. So that system that basically swept into the rest of Nigerian state formation. Yep, and not just Nigeria. It's a pattern that shows up the rest of Africa because I mean colonialism across the board has so many similarities, and chief of them is the state formation itself. Because the states in Africa basically had two functions. It was just an extractive region governed by a particular country. So that same administrative class showed itself, that governing class showed itself across the board. So the way for that class, it now became a method of class moving along the class ladder, moving vertically upwards along the class ladder. So getting political power was the chief way of becoming part of the top class. So handing over the marketing board, aside the hefty salaries we were already eating, was part of, should I say, the contract culture that coming from before the cement armada and downwards, right? You could say it started from there when they started to control state funds and they could dispose it the way they wanted to party members. I mean, there were at least 3 different scandals during that era. I think there was one for a bank about to go under that was giving funds by the NCNC. I mean, the AG is was replete with scandals when the eventual split of the AG brought all that to light. So the control of state resources gave that class formed a new governing class that still appears in Nigeria today. The class who basically leeches off the state. And that's why politics has always been and will continue to be a do or die affair. So like those two things basically have shaped the way Nigeria has grown as a nation.
You're beginning to sound a bit like OEG there, actually, but for good reason, I think, because you're right that you can't run away from the way in which the inheriting elite definitely saw the state very much as their personal pocketbook in those earlier years of the First Republic. And more generally, I think it's an interesting set of points you're raising about some continuities vis-a-vis the sort of view of the state as the kind of source of
the British told them that it was their property.
Yes.
That's what
right. But and I guess like occupying state power, having state power had already been framed as like the way to position oneself as as like above and beyond the regular hoi polloi. From the way the British did it to how our own guys did it. So that's an interesting continuity. Yeah, I guess, to hand Megan the mic and, see if that kind of gives us some bridge to a conclusion. Do you feel like there were, in the face of these continuities, some deviations from the trajectory that were introduced by the First Republic, or would you kind of largely agree with Bobby in a sense that the First Republic was somehow a deepening of these pre-existing trends in terms of how the colonial state, kind of governed class and economic relations?
Mm. Again, I don't think that it's not as straightforward as yeah.
Okay.
But I think that part of what why Nigeria is where it is today is that even though the left isn't as vibrant as it once was, being the first political tendency actually in this country, you can't negate some of the work that he put in the 70s, especially.
But how we take reach the 70s now? Let's finish with First Republic.
70s not the First Republic.
No, I mean,
No,
by the time we get to the 70s, First Republic will finish now.
Don't end.
Because really,
true.
I think the periodization people tend. I mean, unless you're trying to.
School.
Yes,
Yeah,
unless you are trying to introduce a new periodization into the literature.
No. You know, so I always run speed, but the truth of
you slow down first.
But the 70s, I mean, early 70s isn't too far from what I would say. Anyways, I was going to go the difference between indigenization and then Africanization of
No, make we not reach there first.
But I mean, the larger point that I was going to make, depending whichever route that I went, is that for me, that trajectory didn't quite change. Which probably led to the end of the First Republic. I mean, the people who would say that that's what led to the end of the First Republic, because at that point it was no longer. They had to face some sort of challenge. But to clarify about what I meant by First Republic nationalists, or our so-called founding fathers, compromised, sold out, threw a lot of other people under the bus. And I'm speaking essentially. I don't even really get problem with the NPC guys. The ones where I get problem with Nazik and Awolowo themselves. What essentially they did was that the bargain that they reached was, we'll get political power, no matter how small our sphere of influence will be at regional level, but we will. The Brits then say, but you will get this power, but you won't get economic power, all right? And that you will get this power within a limited sphere of influence, all right, which is your dominance. And I think they were fine with it. Every other thing that they tried to do was to see whether, since they have, let's get that one first. So I think they felt to themselves, let's get this power first, whether not for Southwest or for Southeast. Then when we finish, we will now tackle the people with the Brits hand over, the supposed people with Brits hand over power to, which is no, even the political. I mean, the overriding political.
The MPC.
In terms of economic power, they held on to it, and by the time they held on to it, so that by the 1950s, 60s, they had done. I mean, that industrialization that we're speaking about had given birth to many companies. So you then had the John Holt's, the UACs, and all these other guys who were at the mainstay of the Nigerian economy, and the arrangement was such that even on the eve of independence, those guys always had their business interests were represented in the Lagos State House or whatever it was. I can't remember what it was called, which would be the equivalent of maybe your the National House of Assembly or House of Representatives. Now, I can't remember what that was called, but they had a group of about 10 or 13 people who represented business interests, and the way it was, because marketing boards always had, the side that faced the local market, the supply side, but was marketing to the demand side, and then the demand side, which was controlled by big business, or which was controlled by multinationals, up till today, whether you're talking about oil or you're talking about fintech, is now still the same thing. That side that is controlled, where the money comes from, where the capital is coming from, always needs a middleman. So what has happened since independence is that the scam has kept on changing. Because Said, you would know this, that my own start-off point, which might need some revision now, has always been that the scam essentially about Nigeria was the whole idea of independence, which was more flag than it was real independence. And that at the heart of this flag independence was the handover of political power to Nigerians, or a select group of Nigerians, and the sharing of economic power. But if we got into indigenization and then Africanization, you then began to see, where even that elite power, those guys who were handed over the power initially, over a period of time, had started to reorganize to see how they could then indigenize, those things. That's conversation for another day.
No, it very much is. But I'm happy you set the tone for that, because I think we'll get the opportunity to delve into some of those issues further when we have a follow-on session on the reading group. But I hope that the conversation today has given us an opportunity to reflect a bit about the first 3 sessions, at least, of the reading group, which focused again on pre-colonial political economy and intergroup relations, the colonial capitalist economy, and the First Republic. Overall, I think, as reflected in the conversation today, the reading group has allowed a space for quite an interesting debate around, a number of issues, but, fundamental questions around how Nigerian capitalism has developed or been stymied by the different political arrangements that the country has cycled through, the early years of its turbulent history. So, I guess we should probably pause here and, I guess, give people a little bit of suspense so that they, they don't get all the juice that we, got to enjoy in the conversations, and so that, so that they have some incentive to join future conversations. So on that note, let me say thank you to Bobby for making time to join us and engage in this mind-melding odyssey that we've set out for ourselves. Thanks, Bobby.
Oh, Allah. Thank you guys for sitting.
Come back another time. Maybe.
Yeah, we'll have to.
I don't hear what you talk finish.
Come back another time. No be thanks for setting it up. Come back another time.
Shema, don't take me again.
No. Look, those
thank
things
to come back another time.
Both things can happen. Yeah. So no, it would be great to have you again. Bobby. So we look forward to that conversation. So I guess we can leave it there, right?